Excuse me, but you must be mistaken. This section is for first-class passengers. The voice that came from the right was cold and sharp, like a fine needle. Amara Sterling slowly turned her head, feeling the leaden fatigue of the past week press even harder on her shoulders. She had just finished 72 hours of nearly non-stop negotiations in New York. All she wanted for the next 6-hour flight to Los Angeles was to sink into a soft seat and forget the world existed. Her seat, 2A by the window, was occupied. A woman in her 50s sat there, impeccably dressed in a white pantsuit that looked as if it could never wrinkle. Her perfectly styled blonde hair framed a face adorned with gold jewelry, a bracelet and several rings glittering with large stones. The woman's eyes swept over Mara's simple dark gray cashmere tracksuit, her plain sneakers and her makeup-free face. What showed in her expression wasn't just surprise, it was open disdain. "I'm not mistaken," Amara said quietly but clearly. Her voice was a little hoarse after endless meetings. "This is my seat. 2A. She held out her boarding pass, but the woman, her name according to the tag on her expensive bag, was Caroline Whitmore, didn't even glance at it. "That's impossible," Caroline snapped, turning slightly toward the window as if to end the conversation. "I have seat 2A as well. Clearly there's been some sort of system error. You should ask the flight attendant, dear. She'll find you something appropriate, somewhere else." The last words carried a barely hidden implication, one Mara recognized all too well. After 20 years in the tech world dominated by men in tailored suits, she had learned to read such undertones like an open book. Her simple outfit, her skin tone, her tired eyes, in this woman's view, it all added up to one thing: she didn't belong here. Mara took a deep breath, forcing down the surge of irritation rising in her throat. Not now. She was too exhausted for another fight. She had spent the entire week battling board members, investors, and lawyers, and she'd won. The project she defended would save nearly 1,000 jobs. But victory had drained her completely. "I don't want to call the flight attendant," Mara replied evenly. "I just want to sit in the seat I paid for. Please show me your boarding pass." Caroline Whitmore turned toward her slowly, genuine shock flickering across her face at such audacity. She looked at Mara as if she were an ignorant child demanding the impossible. "Listen, I don't know how you got here," Caroline began in a patronizing tone, "but I fly this airline every week. I know all the staff. This is my seat. Perhaps your ticket was a promotional one. Sometimes they sell economy class seats with the possibility of an upgrade if there are any available. But as you can see, there are no free seats." Her voice had a metallic ring to it, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. The man across the aisle lowered his newspaper and glanced at them curiously. Mara felt dozens of eyes on her. Her cheeks burned with humiliation, a familiar feeling but no less bitter for it. She closed her eyes for a moment. An ironic thought flashed through her mind: Ascend Air. 3 years ago, her company Dynamics had bought a controlling stake in this very airline when it was on the brink of bankruptcy. They had invested hundreds of millions in new aircraft, retrained staff, and developed the new customer service software. They had turned a failing company into an industry leader. And now here she was, Amara Sterling, CEO and majority owner, standing in the aisle of a plane that belonged to her, listening to a condescending lecture from a passenger who clearly saw her as someone beneath her. The thought brought no satisfaction, only a dull, throbbing ache. The very system she had worked so hard to rebuild had failed in the simplest, most human way. All their inclusivity training, all the new policies and protocols, powerless in the face of one prejudiced look. "I don't have a discounted ticket," Mara said firmly, opening her eyes. Her voice was steady, emotionless, the professional mask she had perfected over the years. "Never show weakness. Never give anyone a reason to doubt your right to be where you are. I have a standard first-class ticket for seat 2A, and I'm asking you to vacate it." Caroline laughed, a short, unpleasant laugh. "Well, aren't we persistent? Fine, I'll prove you're mistaken." With deliberate slowness, she reached into her designer handbag, pulled out an elegant leather wallet, and took out her boarding pass. She turned it over in her hands, then handed it to Mara as though granting her an enormous favor. "Here, Caroline Whitmore. Seat, she faltered. Her eyes widened as she looked again at the ticket. Confusion flashed across her face, quickly replaced by irritation. 2C, Mara read softly, glancing over her shoulder. Your seat is across the aisle. Silence fell. The man in the neighboring seat smirked faintly and went back to his newspaper. Caroline Whitmore stared at her ticket, then at Mara, and her face flushed, not with embarrassment but with anger. She was not accustomed to being wrong and certainly not to being corrected by someone like Mara. This is absurd, she hissed, tucking the ticket away. I always sit by the window. Always. My assistant would never make such a mistake. It must be some kind of system glitch. She didn't move. She looked at Mara defiantly, as if daring her to back down, to show understanding, and give up the seat she had no right to. Something inside Mara snapped. Her patience, already stretched to the breaking point after a sleepless week, was gone. She was done being understanding, done compromising. All she wanted now was silence and peace in her rightful seat. Whether it's a glitch or an assistant's error doesn't matter, Mara said, her tone suddenly edged with steel. Your seat is 2C. Mine is 2A. I'm asking you one last time, please move. Caroline snorted and leaned back, folding her arms across her chest. I'm not going anywhere. I'm already comfortable. If you want this seat so badly, call the flight attendant and let her deal with it. It was a declaration of war, petty, humiliating, but a war nonetheless, right there in the middle of the first-class cabin. And Mara realized she had no choice but to accept the challenge, not for herself, but for the little girl she once was, the one who'd been told there were places not meant for her. For everyone who had ever faced this kind of arrogance and lacked the power to fight back. She nodded silently, turned, and walked down the aisle to find a flight attendant. The storm inside her was quiet, but no less destructive. She knew this flight would not be peaceful for anyone. Mara found a flight attendant near the galley, a young woman with neatly styled blonde hair and a blue uniform. Her name tag read Megan. She smiled politely as she handed a glass of water to an elderly gentleman. When she noticed Mara, she turned with the same professional, but utterly indifferent, smile. How may I help you? She asked. Hello. There's been a small issue with my seat, Mara said calmly. Another passenger has taken it and refuses to move. My seat is 2A. Megan's smile faltered slightly, replaced by a hint of exasperation. These were the kinds of situations she dreaded, the ones that caused delays and complaints. Of course, we'll take care of it right away. Please follow me. They returned to the scene of the conflict. Caroline Whitmore, seeing them approach, immediately adopted the air of an offended innocent. She looked at Megan with the confident expectation of someone who assumed the staff was always on her side. Oh, there you are, dear, she said in a commanding tone, addressing the flight attendant and completely ignoring Mara. Thank goodness. This lady insists that this is her seat. There must have been a system error. I'm sure, I always fly in this seat. Megan Baker cast a quick, assessing glance at both women. On one side, Caroline, impeccable in her cashmere suit, platinum watch gleaming on her wrist, an expensive ring sparkling on her finger, radiating confidence and entitlement. On the other side stood Mara, dressed simply, though in an expensive dark tracksuit without jewelry, her face tired but composed. For the flight attendant, the choice was obvious. Years of experience in customer service had sharpened her instincts. She could immediately sense where the power lay and, more importantly, where potential trouble for the airline might come from. Let's sort this out, Megan said in a conciliatory tone, speaking mostly to Caroline. Do you have your boarding pass? Of course, Caroline sniffed, pulling out her ticket again. Here, Caroline Whitmore. She didn't show the seat number, quickly slipping the ticket back into her purse. Instead of insisting on checking it, Megan turned toward Mara. May I see yours, please? Mara silently handed her boarding pass over. Megan glanced at it, Amara Sterling, seat 2A, and frowned slightly. She looked from Mara to Caroline, doubt flickering in her eyes, not doubt about who was right, but about how to quietly make this situation disappear. Yes, indeed, she said slowly, returning the ticket to Mara. Your ticket does show seat 2A. And yours, ma'am? She looked at Caroline. Seems to be 2C as we've already established. My assistant must have made a mistake, Caroline said smoothly without blinking. But as you can see, I'm already settled in. I have back problems and the window seat is very important for me. I can't sit in the aisle, people will keep bumping into me. I think this lady could show a bit of understanding. Megan seized on that suggestion like a lifeline. She turned to Mara with a pleading smile. Ma'am, I sincerely apologize for the confusion. Perhaps you could be a little flexible? Seat 2C is also very comfortable. And as an apology, we'd be happy to offer you any drink you'd like. Perhaps a glass of champagne to smooth over this small misunderstanding. The offer wasn't just inappropriate, it was insulting. It reduced Mara's rightful claim to her seat to a petty whim that could be bought off with a glass of cheap sparkling wine. I don't want champagne, Mara replied evenly. I want to sit in the seat I paid for. Seat 2A. The patience on Megan's face began to wear thin. Her smile tightened. I understand your frustration, she said in the patronizing tone used for difficult children. But please understand, the lady is already seated. She has health issues. Asking her to move now would inconvenience everyone. Boarding is almost complete. We can't delay the flight over something so trivial. Perhaps we could offer you a $50 voucher for your next flight. Caroline smiled smugly, leaning back in her seat. She had won. She always won. But Mara didn't move. Her calmness was beginning to unnerve both the flight attendant and Caroline. This is not trivial, Mara said quietly but firmly. This is about following the rules that apply equally to all passengers. $50 won't change the fact that this is my seat. I'm not asking for anything extraordinary. I'm just asking for the rules to be followed. There was no anger in her voice, no resentment, only cold, unyielding logic that left Megan at a loss. She was used to shouts, threats, or resigned compliance. This kind of icy determination threw her completely off balance. She looked at Caroline for help, but the woman only shrugged, silently implying that it was now the attendant's problem. Fine, Megan sighed, realizing there would be no easy solution. Let me check our system, Megan said, forcing a polite smile. Maybe there's been some kind of glitch and we can find you another window seat. She pulled out her service tablet and began typing quickly, her brow furrowed in exaggerated concentration. Around them, the other first-class passengers, who had previously pretended nothing was happening, now watched the unfolding scene with thinly veiled curiosity. A quiet murmur spread through the cabin. Here, look, Megan said after a minute, turning the screen slightly so only Mara could see. The system confirms that seat 2A is indeed yours, and seat 2C belongs to Ms. Whitmore. But see, there's a free window seat in business class, 14F. It's technically a lower class, but we can issue a partial refund for the price difference, plus offer you champagne and a voucher. That's the best I can do. You wouldn't want the captain to delay departure because of us, would you? That was the final straw. The suggestion that she move to a lower class was the height of humiliation. It made one thing painfully clear. The system acknowledged Mara's right, but in practice, it still favored the one who looked wealthier and more influential. Rules existed, but their enforcement depended on who demanded them. No, Mara said sharply, her voice suddenly hard as steel. I will not move to business class. I will not take your voucher. And I will not step aside until your passenger, Ms. Whitmore, vacates my seat. Either you enforce the rules of your own airline, or we'll stand here until someone with actual authority does. The choice is yours. Megan Baker turned pale. She looked from Mara's calm, unbending face to Caroline's smug, aristocratic expression, and realized she was trapped. Whatever she did now would be the wrong choice. If she forced Caroline to move, the woman would almost certainly file a complaint, and that meant trouble for her. If she continued pressuring Mara, this woman, judging by her tone, would not back down, and the confrontation would escalate, delaying the flight. That meant even more trouble. I can't force a passenger to move, Megan stammered weakly. That's your job, Mara interrupted, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. Maintaining order and safety on board, and enforcing seating rules, is part of that job. If you can't handle it, Perhaps you should call the senior flight attendant or the captain. The mention of the captain was a direct threat. For Megan, it meant admitting total incompetence. She shot Mara a look full of open hostility. All traces of professional politeness vanished. The woman standing before Mara now was no longer a courteous flight attendant, but someone cornered, humiliated, and angry. "Fine," she hissed through clenched teeth. "Wait here." She spun on her heel and strode quickly toward the cockpit, leaving Mara standing alone in the aisle under dozens of curious, judging eyes. Caroline Whitmore gave a triumphant little snort and pulled a compact mirror from her purse to fix her hair, confident that the captain would soon arrive and put this stubborn upstart in her place. She was certain that the captain, a disciplined man who valued order above all, would quickly put this stubborn woman in her place so the plane could finally take off. Mara, however, stood motionless, feeling a cold fury rising inside her. It was no longer about a seat. It was about dignity, about the quiet, systemic indifference she had just seen in Megan's eyes. The kind of indifference that allowed some people to believe they were above the rules, while forcing others to constantly prove they deserved even the most basic respect. And Mara knew, this fight, which had begun over a single window seat, she would see through to the end. The silence in the first-class cabin became almost tangible. Barely 5 minutes had passed, yet it felt like an eternity. Passengers who had previously pretended not to notice were now whispering openly, glancing between Mara, still standing calmly in the aisle, and Caroline Whitmore, who flipped through a glossy magazine with exaggerated indifference. Finally, the curtain separating the galley from the cabin parted. Megan reappeared, followed by a tall man in the immaculate uniform of an airline captain. His face wore the mask of professional courtesy, but the cold blue eyes betrayed irritation. This was Captain Robert Hansen, a man for whom the flight schedule was sacred and any delay a personal insult. "Good afternoon," he said in a firm, even tone that instantly silenced the whispers. "I'm Captain Hansen. Megan has informed me that we've had a small misunderstanding. Let's resolve it quickly so we can depart on time." His gaze swept over all three women, the humiliated and angry Megan, the self-satisfied Caroline, and the calm, unmoving Mara. His judgment was immediate and predictable. He turned to Mara as if she were the source of the problem. "Ma'am," he began, "I understand there's been an unfortunate mix-up with the seating. Mrs. Whitmore wasn't feeling well and took the first available seat to recover. We apologize for the inconvenience. Megan has offered you an excellent alternative, a seat in business class and generous compensation. I strongly urge you to accept it. The entire plane is waiting for departure." His words were carefully chosen. He had framed Caroline as a victim of circumstance, and Mara as the obstinate one delaying nearly 200 people. It was a classic pressure tactic designed to invoke guilt. "Captain," Mara said, her voice calm but edged with ice, "there's no misunderstanding. There are rules on your aircraft that require passengers to sit in the seat indicated on their boarding pass. -2A. This lady has taken it and refuses to move. Your flight attendant not only failed to resolve the issue, but suggested that I downgrade myself to a lower class. That's not a solution, that's an escalation." Captain Hansen frowned slightly. He hadn't expected such a clear, confident response. "Look, I appreciate your sense of principle," he said, softening his tone in an attempt at persuasion. "But we have to be practical. Asking Mrs. Whitmore to move now would only cause more disruption and delay. She's already settled. Showing a bit of flexibility on your part is the quickest and easiest way for all of us to get airborne. Please think about the other passengers." He gestured around the cabin as if to summon the silent approval of everyone present, an appeal to collective pressure, painting Mara as selfish. Caroline Whitmore gave a loud, theatrical sigh and turned toward the window, pretending to be above the conversation. In row 7B, a young woman named Jenna Lynn discreetly adjusted her phone on the fold-down tray. A student and a travel blogger with a small but loyal following, she sensed that something extraordinary was unfolding. Without hesitation, she started a live stream. The tiny red light on her phone was invisible to the cabin crew, but it was already broadcasting the unfolding drama to thousands of viewers. Her camera caught everything, Mara's composed but steely face, the irritated captain, and Caroline's smug indifference. "Captain," Mara replied evenly, "I have thought about the other passengers. That's exactly why I'm insisting the rules be followed. Because if today you allow one person to break them for their convenience or status, tomorrow someone else will too. Order on board, and safety, begin with something simple. Passengers sitting where they are assigned." Her words struck like a clear, ringing note in the heavy silence. A few passengers nodded quietly in agreement. The captain's pressure was beginning to backfire. "I'm the captain here," Hansen snapped, losing his patience. His professional mask was starting to crack. "And I decide what constitutes safety on my aircraft. Right now, the greatest safety risk is a delayed departure caused by your stubbornness. Excuse me for interrupting." The voice that came from the side was calm, steady, and carried a quiet strength. Everyone turned. In seat 3 sat an elegant woman in her 50s, with short silver-streaked hair and sharp brown eyes. A notebook and pen rested neatly on her tray. It was Gabriela Ramirez, one of the most respected investigative journalists in the country, known for her exposés on corporate ethics and abuse of power. She addressed Captain Hansen, though her gaze was fixed pointedly on the nameplate pinned to his chest. "Captain Hansen," she said evenly, "am I understanding your airline's policy correctly? If one passenger occupies another's seat without authorization, the responsibility for resolving the situation falls entirely on the wrong party." The captain was momentarily taken aback by the unexpected question. He had no idea who this woman was, but her confident tone and precise phrasing instantly put him on alert. "This is a non-standard situation," he muttered through clenched teeth. "We're simply trying to find the most efficient resolution." "Of course," Gabriela replied with a small nod, never breaking eye contact. "But I'd like to understand the procedure. Did you or your flight attendant actually verify the boarding passes of both passengers?" Behind the captain, Megan Baker flushed crimson. She realized she hadn't done the most basic thing. She had never asked Caroline to show her ticket. She had simply taken her word for it. "The situation was obvious," the captain muttered, realizing how weak that sounded. "What exactly was obvious?" Gabriela pressed softly but firmly. "That the woman who looks wealthier is automatically in the right? Or that the one dressed more simply must yield? I'm simply trying to understand the logic of your actions. Is this Ascend Air's official protocol, or your personal judgment?" Her words were like precise thrusts of a rapier. She didn't accuse, she dissected, exposing the absurdity of what was happening, making both the captain and the flight attendant look incompetent before the entire cabin. Now the passengers were no longer just watching, they were listening intently. Meanwhile, Jenna Lynn's livestream had already reached over 10,000 viewers, with comments flooding in, almost all in support of Mara. "I'm not required to justify my actions to you," Captain Hansen barked, losing control completely. He could feel the situation slipping away from him. "You are responsible for this flight," Gabriela countered, her voice now ringing with quiet steel. "And that responsibility includes upholding the rights of all passengers. Right now, you and your crew are showing blatant disregard for those rights, for this woman's rights." Her eyes narrowed. "You didn't check the documents. You applied pressure to the wrong person. You publicly accused her of delaying the flight, when in fact the person at fault is someone else entirely. I imagine Ascend Air's legal department will be very interested in a detailed account of this incident." The mention of the legal department hit Hansen like a bucket of cold water. He realized, too late, that this wasn't just some nosy passenger. He looked at her sharp, intelligent face and felt a wave of panic. The flight was turning into a disaster before takeoff. He glanced at Mara, who had been silently watching the exchange. In her eyes there was no fear, no anger, only cold, calm certainty. She wasn't a victim. She was a judge. The tension in the cabin reached its peak. The air felt thick, charged. The passengers sat frozen, waiting for the inevitable resolution. Caroline Whitmore finally realized the situation had turned against her. Her once arrogant expression faltered, replaced by confusion. Captain Hansen drew a deep breath, struggling to regain composure. He was cornered. To admit he was wrong before the entire cabin was unthinkable. To keep pressuring Mara, now that a sharp-eyed journalist had intervened, was dangerous. So he made a decision. A decision he thought would reassert his authority at any cost. "Enough," he thundered, his voice echoing through the cabin. Straightening to his full height, he fixed Mara with a hard stare. "Ma'am, I'm giving you one final chance. Either you immediately take the seat offered in business class, or I will consider your behavior an act of insubordination toward the captain of this aircraft, and I'll call security to remove you from the flight. The choice is yours. Make it now." It was an ultimatum, a direct threat. He was betting that, faced with such a prospect, any woman would back down. He didn't see Jenna Lynn zooming her phone camera in to capture Mara's face. He didn't know that Gabriela Ramirez was already recording his words verbatim in her notebook. All he saw was a calm, dark-skinned woman in a simple tracksuit, and he was absolutely certain of his victory. Silence fell over the cabin, broken only by the low hum of the engines. The captain's ultimatum hung in the air, heavy and menacing. Dozens of eyes were fixed on Mara, waiting for her reaction, her capitulation. Captain Hansen stood tall, shoulders squared, his face radiating the cold confidence of a man convinced he had regained control. Behind him, Megan Baker fidgeted nervously, wringing her hands, her gaze darting between her superior and Mara. Caroline Whitmore, seeing that the highest authority on board was firmly on her side, couldn't suppress a triumphant smirk. She leaned closer to Mara and hissed, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Sweetheart, I don't know what minority program got you that ticket, but people like you should know your place. And your place isn't here." It was said. The final line had been crossed. Gabriela Ramirez's gaze turned to ice. Jenna Lynn's fingers trembled slightly as she held her phone, but she didn't stop recording. Even Captain Hansen flinched at the blatant venom in Caroline's voice, but he said nothing, silently condoning his ally's cruelty. Mara did not reply. She didn't even look at Caroline. Slowly, with terrifying calm, she lowered her gaze. There was no haste in her movements, no fear. It was as if she stood at the center of a hurricane, utterly still and untouched by the chaos around her. She adjusted the sleeve of her simple tracksuit, then just as deliberately slipped her hand into her pocket and pulled out her phone, a sleek, elegant device with no decorations. Captain Hansen scoffed. "Really? You're going to call someone? Record us like some kid?" he sneered. "You don't have time for that. Your time is up." Mara ignored him. Her thumb slid across the screen, unlocking it in a single fluid motion. Not a single muscle in her face moved. She opened an app, a blue icon with a white, stylized letter E. Passengers seated nearby could see the name beneath it, Ihiram Dynamics. Her fingers moved with surgical precision. She navigated to a secure section, entered a long password, then pressed her fingertip to the scanner. A control panel opened on the screen, filled with charts, analytics, and system data. One of the tabs read Ascendair. Mara tapped it. A new dashboard appeared, displaying flight metrics and operations data. In the top right corner glowed a small red button labeled Executive Override Protocol. Captain Hansen was losing patience. "I won't say it again," he snapped. "Security has already been called." Mara lifted her gaze to him. There was nothing in her eyes, no fear, no anger, only cold, empty stillness. Then she looked at Caroline, whose smirk was frozen halfway between arrogance and disbelief. Finally, her eyes settled on Megan Baker's terrified face. Mara's finger pressed the red button. A confirmation window appeared. "Activate protocol? This action is irreversible and holds the highest priority." Mara pressed yes. A text field appeared. Calmly, letter by letter, she typed, "Flight 737. Return to gate immediately. Reason, executive intervention by CEO." She hit send. At that exact moment in the cockpit, a sharp, piercing tone rang out, one the first officer had never heard before. It was unlike any standard alarm. Across the primary display, overriding all flight data, flashed a single red message. Direct order, highest priority. Return to gate immediately. Confirm receipt. What is that? The first officer exclaimed, staring at the cockpit display, but Captain Hansen was still standing frozen in the cabin. At that same moment, a panicked voice came through his headset, the one he hadn't taken off. Ascend 737, this is the control tower. We've received a high-priority executive command for your flight. Confirm immediate return to Gate 42. Repeat, return to Gate 42 immediately. Captain Hansen's face went pale. He was stunned. A top-priority command, bypassing him, the aircraft commander. That was impossible. It had to be a system error, or a mistake from the tower. This is Captain Hansen, he said sharply. We have a malfunction in our system. Repeat, on what authority was this order issued? I am the commanding officer of this aircraft. There was a brief pause. Then the controller's voice returned, tighter, almost nervous now. Captain, this is not an error. The command is verified. It came through a secure channel, directly from the CEO of Airline Dynamics, the majority shareholder of Ascend Air. I repeat, return to gate immediately. That is a direct order. The world around Hansen collapsed in an instant. The CEO of Airline Dynamics. He turned his head slowly, almost in a daze, toward the woman in the tracksuit. She was calmly sliding her phone back into her pocket. Realization hit him like a freight train. Cold sweat broke out across his forehead. His knees went weak. He looked at her face, the face he had just humiliated. The face of his ultimate superior. The owner of the entire airline. His gaze darted to Megan Baker. The flight attendant, having overheard the exchange between the captain and the control tower, stood frozen like a statue. Her mouth was half open in a silent gasp, her eyes wide with horror. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her ghostly pale. She understood everything. Caroline Whitmore was the last to realize. She hadn't heard the conversation, but she saw the change in Hansen and Megan, the way their confidence evaporated, replaced by something primal, fear. She glanced between them, then at Mara, confused and uneasy. What's happening? Why are you looking at her like that? At that very moment, the aircraft, which had already begun taxiing toward the runway, slowed to a halt, then, to the astonishment of every passenger, began rolling backward, returning toward the terminal. The soft murmur in the cabin swelled into a full-blown uproar. Passengers whispered loudly, pointed, filmed. And in row 7B, Jenna Lynn continued streaming live, her camera now locked on the ashen, terrified face of Captain Hansen. The viewer count had passed 50,000. Gabriela Ramirez closed her notebook. She already knew what her next article would be about. Captain Hansen took a step toward Mara. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Only a strangled, hoarse sound escaped his throat. He wanted to apologize, to beg, but his mind refused to form the words. Amara Sterling, the CEO of the company that owned the airline, looked at him calmly. There was no anger, no triumph, no gloating in her eyes, only a cold, detached assessment. She wasn't looking at him as a person anymore, but as a faulty component in a massive system, one that needed to be replaced. The plane was slowly approaching the gate. Through the windows, ground crew members could already be seen, staring in confusion at the aircraft unexpectedly returning to the terminal. Caroline Whitmore finally began to sense that something was very wrong. What did you do?" she stammered, her voice trembling. "Who are you?" For the first time in a long while, Mara looked her directly in the eyes. Her voice was calm, even, but every word carried through the silent cabin. "I'm the one who just bought your silence," she said quietly. "And it cost you more than you can imagine." The clank of the jet bridge locking onto the fuselage echoed through the first-class cabin like a hammer striking an anvil. The airplane came to a complete stop. Outside, the ground staff were bustling about, but inside, time seemed frozen. Every passenger sat motionless, holding their breath, their eyes fixed on the small group gathered near the cockpit door. On the woman in a simple tracksuit whose calmness was more terrifying than any shout. On the captain whose face had turned to a lifeless gray mask. On the flight attendant silently mouthing words she couldn't say aloud. And on the well-dressed passenger who was only now beginning to grasp the magnitude of her mistake. Then, with a hiss of pressurized air, the aircraft door opened. 3 people appeared in the doorway. At the front was a tall, silver-haired man in a flawlessly tailored navy blue suit, a gold Ascend Air insignia gleaming on his lapel. His expression radiated a mix of grave concern and bureaucratic zeal. Behind him stood 2 uniformed airport security officers, their faces set and unreadable. The man in the suit, Arthur Davis, shift manager and senior Ascend Air representative at JFK Airport, stepped into the cabin and immediately strode toward Captain Hansen. "Captain, report," he demanded sharply, his tone clipped and authoritative, ignoring everyone else. "What's the emergency? Why did this aircraft return to the terminal? The controllers are saying there was a direct order from corporate headquarters. Is this some kind of joke?" Captain Hansen flinched as if struck. He couldn't tear his eyes away from Mara. His trembling finger pointed toward her. "Her," he rasped. "She gave the order." Arthur Davis frowned even more deeply, confusion clouding his face. He turned his gaze toward Mara, scanning her from head to toe. The sight of a woman in a simple tracksuit standing in the middle of the first-class cabin, apparently the cause of this entire disruption, filled him with visible irritation. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but I'll have to ask you." "Mr. Davis," Mara interrupted, her voice calm and steady, yet so firm that the airline representative stopped mid-sentence. "My name is Amara Sterling. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Airline Dynamics." The name and title were spoken simply, without any hint of arrogance, but their effect hit like a bomb. Arthur Davis froze. His professional composure shattered. Disbelief flashed across his face, followed by the dawning horror of realization. He knew that Airline Dynamics had recently become the airline's parent company. He had seen the photos of the new CEO in corporate memos and newsletters. And now, staring into the calm, unflinching face of the woman before him, he recognized her. The blood drained from his face. Miss Sterling," he stammered, his voice stripped of all authority. I apologize. We weren't informed of your presence on this flight." "That was precisely the point, Mr. Davis," Mara replied evenly. "I wanted to see how my company operates, from the inside. And I've seen more than enough." She paused briefly, her eyes sweeping over the frozen figures of Captain Hansen and the terrified flight attendant. Then her gaze came to rest on Caroline Whitmore. "And now," Mara continued, addressing Davis though her eyes never left Caroline, "we have a few matters to settle. Let's start with this passenger." She tilted her head slightly, feigning the effort of recalling a name. "Whitmore. Caroline Whitmore," the woman stammered, her voice trembling. All her former arrogance had vanished without a trace. She looked at Mara with pleading eyes, like a schoolgirl caught misbehaving before a strict headmistress. "Ms. Whitmore," Mara nodded. "Mr. Davis, I want you to personally oversee the paperwork. As of this moment, this passenger is to be permanently blacklisted from Ascend Air. For life." Caroline gasped. "For life? But why? This is all a misunderstanding. I only—" "You took someone else's seat," Mara interrupted coldly. "You refused to vacate it. You lied to a flight attendant. You made racially offensive remarks. And you caused a flight delay and forced an unscheduled return to the terminal. Do you believe that's not sufficient? But I didn't know who you were." Caroline cried out, her voice cracking with desperation. "If I had known." "And that," Mara cut her off, "is your greatest mistake, Ms. Whitmore. Your behavior should never depend on who stands before you. You acted as you did because you thought you could, because my appearance didn't match your idea of who deserves to sit in first class. Ascend Air is a company built on dignity and respect for every customer. You violated those principles in the crudest way possible." She turned to the 2 security officers. "Please escort Ms. Whitmore off the plane. Make sure her luggage is removed and delivered to her in the terminal." "Wait, please." Caroline tried to step toward Mara, but one of the officers blocked her path. "You can't do this. I have an important meeting in Los Angeles. My husband, he's a very influential man. He'll sue your airline." Mara's lips curved in the faintest hint of a smile. Then tell your husband he's welcome to contact our legal department, she said evenly. They'll be expecting him. And now please, leave the aircraft. You're holding up the other passengers. The panic on Caroline's face curdled into helpless rage. She looked around, searching for support, but saw only disapproving or indifferent stares. Jenna Lynn's smartphone was still pointed directly at her, and Caroline Whitmore suddenly realized that her humiliation was being streamed live. Crushed, she lowered her head and allowed the security officers to escort her down the aisle. Her expensive handbag dragged limply along the floor. When her sleek white suit disappeared through the open door, a heavy silence fell over the cabin. Now every gaze was fixed on the two remaining culprits, Captain Hansen and Megan Baker. Mara turned to them. Her face showed no anger, only composed, businesslike focus. Captain Hansen, she began formally. As the commanding officer of this aircraft, your foremost duty is to ensure safety and order on board, by strictly adhering to company policy and procedures. Yes, ma'am, the captain managed to whisper. Today you violated those procedures in the most basic way. Instead of resolving a passenger dispute according to protocol, by verifying boarding passes and restoring the rightful passenger's seat, you chose the path of least resistance. You placed pressure on the wrong passenger, urging her to be understanding for the convenience of the offender, and for the sake of saving your own time. You demonstrated a complete lack of professionalism and a disregard for company policy. The captain opened his mouth to protest, but no words came. Everything she said was the truth. Mr. Davis, Mara continued evenly, Captain Hansen is to be relieved of duty immediately. Please collect his credentials and escort him to the operations office to initiate a formal investigation. His personal belongings will be returned to him later. Yes, Miss Sterling, Davis replied quietly. He gestured to one of the remaining security officers. Captain Hansen staggered slightly. Being grounded, removed from flight duty, was a death sentence for a pilot's career. A decade of spotless service, thousands of hours in the sky, all erased by one moment of moral failure. He looked at Mara, desperation flickering in his eyes. Miss Sterling, please, it was a mistake. I just wanted to avoid a delay. You didn't avoid one, Captain, Mara replied mercilessly. You caused it. Your job is to make the right decisions, not the easy ones. And you failed. Moving like a man in a dream, Robert Hansen unclipped the gold wings from his uniform and handed them to Arthur Davis. His hands trembled. Yesterday he had been the captain of a modern airliner, a respected professional. Today he was unemployed and disgraced before hundreds of witnesses. Finally it was Megan Baker's turn. The flight attendant stood with her head bowed, tears streaming down her cheeks. She didn't try to wipe them away. When Mara addressed her, she flinched as though struck. Miss Baker. I'm sorry, Megan whispered through her sobs. I don't know what came over me. She just seemed so confident, and you. And I, Mara finished for her, didn't look like what you imagine a first-class passenger should look like. There was no anger in her tone, only calm truth. Your job, Miss Baker, isn't to judge people by their appearance. Your job is to serve customers and follow procedure. You did neither, Mara continued, her voice still calm but edged with quiet authority. You didn't check the boarding pass. You took one passenger's word at face value and ignored the rightful claim of another. You didn't just fail to do your job, you became a participant in someone's humiliation. Megan broke down, sobbing openly now. I didn't mean to, I swear. I just panicked. Please don't fire me. I have 2 children, a mortgage. I'll do anything you ask. I'll take any retraining, any course, please. Mara watched her for a long moment. For the first time that day, something resembling empathy flickered across her face. She didn't see a villain. She saw an ordinary woman who had made a terrible mistake, driven by bias and fear rather than malice. Your future with this company, Mara said at last, her tone softer but still firm, will depend on the outcome of an internal investigation. However, like the captain, you are suspended from duty pending its conclusion. She turned slightly toward Arthur Davis. Mr. Davis, Make sure Ms. Baker is contacted by Human Resources and briefed on all procedures. She may also require access to psychological support. Megan nodded, unable to speak. She was devastated, but in the CEO's words she heard the faintest echo of hope. Perhaps it wasn't over yet. Having dealt with those responsible, Amara Sterling turned to the stunned first-class passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said clearly and firmly, her voice steady and commanding. "On behalf of Ascend Air, I offer you my sincerest apologies for the inconvenience and the delay. We understand that your time is valuable. Within the next 30 minutes, a new crew will board, and we will continue our flight to Los Angeles. As compensation for your patience, every passenger on this flight will receive additional miles as well as a travel voucher for future flights. Thank you for your understanding." A round of restrained but approving applause rippled through the cabin. The passengers who had just witnessed the extraordinary scene unfold looked at Mara with open admiration. She hadn't just punished the guilty, she had done so with dignity, without spite or vengeance. She acted like a true leader, decisive, fair, and focused on solving the systemic issue, not simply the momentary conflict. Gabriela Ramirez scribbled notes rapidly in her notebook. This wouldn't just be an article about a scandal in the skies, it was the story of a new kind of leader, one who stood firm against prejudice no matter the form it took. Mara gave a brief nod to Arthur Davis, who still stood beside her, ready to carry out any instruction. "Arthur, see that everything is handled exactly as ordered," she said. "I won't be taking this flight. I have new, and more pressing, business to attend to here in New York." Her eyes flicked once more toward seat 2A, still empty, before she turned and walked toward the exit. Behind her, the cabin buzzed like a shaken hive, a mixture of awe, whispers, and quiet reflection, as she left behind not just a scene of reckoning, but the beginning of a new era for the entire airline. The moment Amara Sterling stepped off the jet bridge into the bustling terminal, she was immediately surrounded by a wall of people. Passengers from other flights, curious airport employees, and travelers drawn by the rare sight of a plane returning to its gate. Dozens of phones were raised high, cameras capturing her every step. The air hummed with murmurs, gasps, and the rapid-fire clicks of shutters. Out of the crowd shot Gabriela Ramirez, driven by instinct and adrenaline, recorder already in hand. Her eyes blazed with professional intensity. Right beside her hurried Jenna Lynn, still live-streaming, her phone now aimed not at the plane, but at the woman who had just become the central figure of a story that was already circling the globe. "Miss Sterling." Gabriela Ramirez, New York Tribune. The journalist introduced herself quickly, stepping into Mara's path. "What we've just witnessed was unprecedented. Tell me, was this your personal response to an insult, or have we just seen the birth of a new, stricter policy at Ascend Air?" Mara stopped. She could have ignored the question and walked past, protected by the airport staff now closing in around her. But in Gabriela's eyes she saw not just the hunger for a headline, but genuine curiosity about the deeper issue. She looked around at the sea of faces, at the phone cameras streaming her every move to thousands, perhaps millions, of people. And she realized this moment mattered more than the board meeting she had been flying to. This wasn't the end of the story. It was its true beginning. She drew a deep breath, collecting her thoughts. When she spoke, her voice was calm yet carried such weight that the noise of the terminal began to fade. People lowered their phones and simply listened. "Thank you for your question, Ms. Ramirez. What happened today aboard Flight 372 wasn't a personal incident. It's a symptom of something far deeper, a serious illness that affects not only our airline but the entire industry. This isn't just about one arrogant passenger who thought her status gave her the right to demean others. Nor is it only about a single flight attendant or a single captain who gave in to pressure and prejudice. The problem is systemic, a culture that quietly enables such behavior, where bias hides behind excuses like avoiding delays or being understanding, and where there are no clear, inevitable consequences for disrespecting human dignity." Gabriela nodded quickly, pressing the record button on her voice recorder to make sure it was capturing every word. "You're talking about systemic change," she said. "But what concrete steps will you, as the head of the company that owns Ascend Air, take?" Words are powerful, but people want action. And they'll get it, Mara replied firmly. Her gaze swept over the crowd, pausing briefly on Jenna Lynn, who stood wide-eyed, still live-streaming every second. Effective immediately, Mara said, her tone clear and resolute. I'm announcing the launch of a new global initiative, one that will extend beyond Ascend Air to include all our partner companies. We're calling it Dignity in Flight. A ripple of approval moved through the crowd. The name was simple, direct, and hit exactly where it needed to. This isn't just a marketing slogan or another round of staff training, Mara continued, raising her hand to keep the crowd's attention. This will be a technological solution, backed by full transparency. My parent company, Ihiram Dynamics, is one of the leading providers of software for the global aviation industry. We serve dozens of airlines worldwide, and starting tomorrow, our engineers will begin implementing a mandatory update across all of our management systems. She paused again. In the silence, the distant rumble of aircraft outside the windows could be heard. We will integrate a new mandatory module into the system, she said. It will record, in real time, every passenger complaint related to discrimination, bias, or any form of inappropriate behavior, whether from staff or fellow passengers. Every report will be investigated, not by an airline's internal department, but by an independent commission. And most importantly, Mara raised her voice, ensuring everyone could hear. The data from this module will be public, completely transparent. Anyone will be able to visit a dedicated website and see which airlines have the highest respect rating for passengers, and which ones lag behind. Airlines will no longer be able to sweep incidents under the rug or issue empty apologies. Their reputation will become measurable, a tangible number, and passengers will be able to vote with their wallets, choosing carriers that demonstrate real respect for their customers. The effect of her words hit like an explosion. Gabriela Ramirez slowly lowered her recorder, her eyes wide with disbelief. She realized she was witnessing not just a corporate announcement, but a seismic shift in the entire industry. This wasn't a blow against Caroline Whitmore or Megan Baker. It was a blow against the entire rotten system. Miss Sterling, Gabriela said, her voice trembling slightly, you do realize you're declaring war on the entire aviation sector. Many airlines will refuse to use your software. Mara looked at her with a faint, almost amused smile. Let them try, she said. Our systems are deeply embedded in their operations. Switching to another provider would take years and cost billions. It will be far simpler, and far cheaper, for them to change how they treat people. We're not giving them a choice. We're forcing them to become better. Dignity is not a privilege you buy with a first-class ticket. It's a basic human right, for everyone who steps on board an aircraft. From this day forward, my company and all its subsidiaries will defend that right, not just in words but in action at 30,000 feet, and here on the ground. She finished speaking. For a few seconds the terminal was completely silent, and then it erupted. These weren't just applause, they were cheers of approval. People clapped, shouted, bravo, even whistled. They weren't applauding a CEO, they were applauding a human being who had just restored their faith in justice. Amara Sterling gave Gabriela a small nod, then another to the crowd, and without another word, turned and walked toward the exit, accompanied by an airport staff member, leaving behind the echo of ovations and the beginning of a new era in civil aviation. 2 years later, Amara Sterling once again sat by the window in first class, seat 2A, on Flight 372 from New York to Los Angeles. Same route, same seat, but a completely different meaning. Once a year on the same day she took this flight, no entourage, no security, no announcements. Just her, the sky, and the quiet hum of the cabin. Today, a young flight attendant in a navy blue uniform smiled at her, not out of duty but with genuine warmth. Welcome aboard, Miss Sterling. I'm Elena. May I offer you anything before takeoff? Still water, please, Mara replied. Elena nodded, then returned with the drink but lingered for a moment. I just have to say, thank you, she said, blushing slightly. I joined Ascend Air a year and a half ago. After that day, I remember watching the stream on my phone. I couldn't believe something like that could even happen, and then I learned who you were." She hesitated, then smiled softly. "In my family they used to say people like us would never make it up there, never into the sky. But now, here I am. Because of you." Mara smiled faintly. "Not because of me," she said. "Because of everyone who chose to stay and change the rules. You're part of that." The aircraft taxied toward the runway. Lights streaked past the window. Mara's mind drifted back to that day, standing in the aisle, surrounded by suspicion and doubt. Now silence. No stares pushing her out. No polite request to understand. A magazine rested on her lap. On its cover, her own face, serious, almost passport-like. The caption read, "2 years. 1 order. A New Altitude." By Gabriela Ramirez. The same journalist who had once stood up and spoken out when the entire cabin stayed silent. Since that day, since Amara Sterling activated the executive override protocol and turned the plane back to the terminal, the aviation industry had begun to change. Slowly, unevenly, but undeniably. The so-called dignity index had become more than a corporate metric. It had become a mirror for airlines, pilots, and passengers alike. Complaints were no longer buried. They were tracked, investigated, and published. The article cited statistics. In just 2 years, reported cases of biased behavior had dropped by 73%. On some airlines, passengers were seeing, for the first time, female pilots and pilots with last names that had never made it past the final interview rounds before. Airlines that tried to resist the system lost passengers faster than they could lower their ticket prices. But perhaps the most important change was subtler. People had begun to look up and truly see each other. Not just those in Kashmir. Not just those who spoke without an accent. But everyone beside them. Mara flipped to the middle of the article. A section titled, "Where Are They Now?" Megan Baker. The flight attendant who started the conflict. She underwent mandatory retraining, not without controversy. But after a public statement admitting, "I didn't check, I assumed. That was my mistake. And I was lucky not to be fired on the spot," she was allowed to stay. A year later, she became one of the first compliance coordinators for the new dignity protocols. Now, she headed the airline's Customer Experience Integrity Division. Caroline Whitmore. Her name disappeared for months, then resurfaced in business headlines. A scandalous resignation from a hotel board, a string of failed partnerships, and leaked emails revealing attempts to use influence. Her last public appearance, a podcast interview. Her voice was quiet. "I lived in a world where I thought I could do anything. But when you stand in the eye of the storm, you learn that power isn't strength, it's consequence." Jenna Lynn. The young woman who had filmed the entire event. In 2 years, she became a media figure. Her channel, Flight View, now had 2.4 million subscribers. She covered aviation ethics, psychology, and human behavior in the skies. She and Gabriela Ramirez now co-chaired the Visible Human Foundation, the very initiative Mara launched right after Flight 372. The foundation provided support to passengers facing discrimination, covering legal costs, gathering evidence, and training volunteers. The cabin had come alive again. Flight attendants served drinks. Someone laughed. Someone else drifted to sleep under a blanket. Across the aisle sat a family, a man in his 40s and his young daughter. The girl, maybe 6, dark-skinned and wearing a yellow hoodie, gazed out the window as if watching a movie. Then a tall woman in a pilot's uniform walked down the aisle, calm, confident, East Asian. The little girl leaned toward her father. "Daddy, look. They have a lady pilot." The pilot turned, caught the girl's wide-eyed look, and with a small smile winked. "Maybe you'll be one too," she said quietly. "We'll be waiting." Mara turned her gaze back to the window. The sky was the same as it had been 2 years ago, but inside everything was different. Not victory. Not triumph. Simple, clear, steady, like the words she had once told herself. Dignity isn't a service. It's the altitude from which every flight begins. The pilot disappeared behind the curtain to the cockpit. The plane settled into soft silence, cruising smoothly at altitude. Mara closed the magazine and set it aside. Outside, the ocean of clouds stretched endlessly below. She whispered to herself, "This isn't about me anymore. And that, she knew, was the most important thing of all. A few years earlier, the day after the incident, Dynamics headquarters had been in turmoil. Lawyers warned her. If you go through with this, every legacy airline, every insurer, every advisory board will come after you. The board was split, but Mara didn't ask for permission. She simply informed them. We can't build technology that makes life easier while ignoring those who are denied the right to live it. It'll be written into the code. And so, the Dignity module was born, embedded into every booking and operations system. It tracked complaints, calculated a real-time respect index, and automatically alerted internal auditors. A year later, a major Latin American carrier refused to implement the update and switched to a competitor's software. 3 months later, they faced a public scandal. The passengers had been removed from the flight because of their appearance. The video spread across the world. No one blamed Mara directly, but the industry understood everything. 6 months later, that same airline came back, on her terms. Miss Sterling? Mara turned. Before her stood an elderly man in a gray suit. He looked hesitant but composed. I'm sorry to bother you, he said. I'm sitting in the 3rd row. You are the one, aren't you? That depends on which one you mean, Mara replied gently. The one who turned the plane around, he said, awkwardly smiling. I was on that flight. I saw it all. I stayed silent. He paused, lowering his eyes before continuing. But later my son sent me an article. We hadn't spoken in years, politics, views, you know. After reading it, he called me and said, Dad, did you see how it's done? And we talked. Really talked. For the first time in a long time. He straightened his back. Thank you for not backing down that day. Even when we all sat there, heads down. Mara nodded. Sometimes, she said softly, for someone to stand up, someone else has to stay standing. She watched as he returned to his seat, then turned back to the window. Far below, above the clouds, another flight glided through the sky. On the tracking screen it read, Ascend 728, Portland to Washington. A tiny icon and beside it, System Data. Respect rating, 9.6. Complaints, 0. Underneath were brief public comments. Pilot assisted a passenger with disabilities. Flight attendant didn't overlook a single request. That was the real outcome. Not a company. Not a punishment. A system, one where kindness had become a measurable value. A standard. Somewhere behind her, the little girl laughed again. Daddy, she said, can I be a captain like the lady pilot? Of course, her father smiled. You already have everything except the badge. And if they don't let me, the girl said, then you'll press the red button, like Auntie Mara. Laughter rippled through the cabin. Mara didn't laugh, but her lips trembled slightly, the ghost of a smile. When the announcement came about their descent, she reached for her bag. On top lay an old notebook, the same one she'd carried that day. Inside, a blue sticky note. Only 2 lines were written. If it happens again, don't hesitate. If no one stands up, you. She closed the notebook. The plane was calm again, but somewhere in the world, someone was just beginning their own journey, perhaps from an economy seat by the window, feeling the weight of others' eyes on their back. And if, on that journey, they ever encountered another Caroline, or another Captain Hansen, they would know. This altitude is now protected. And at the moment when the landing gear touched the runway, and the word LAX flashed past the window, Amara Sterling knew. This was the first flight where she truly felt light. Because now the cabin was filled with people, not just passengers. And the sky had finally opened to those who once could only look up from below.